quick. My avatar.
Oh, hang on. Oh, you're good. Go for
And
it.
we are good. Perfect.
So, hello and good day. So, this is going to be the inaugural episode of Among the Ruins, a show about civilization's decline and where to go from here. So, I'm your host, the Heroic Will, and our guest today is Philo Miscellany, a YouTuber and commentator on philosophy, politics, and religion. Philos, welcome to the Ashes, my friend.
Hello, hello. Good morning, good evening, and good night for our listeners everywhere. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Happy to have you. So, Philos, I wanted to get your assistance on trying to diagnose something I'm calling Clown World Assimilation. And this term I've kind of inherited from an article, or a substack rather, written by Aaron McIntyre, related to how the artifacts of Clown World are much less any sort of sense of self-expression, but rather a uniform that these different institutions are putting on to signal a level of commitment to what would be kind of the gay regime, the great American empire, and quite literally one that is advocating what would be something that's probably gay. Uh, Stepping from that, you've had some very interesting thoughts and comments since we've kind of been talking off air. Um, One, you read the article, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Perfect. So, what really stuck out to me is the inversion of how, not inversion, that's the wrong way to put it, but the natural inclination one would have to mock and ridicule such behavior, such false realities, such blatant contradictions. All of that natural inclination has to be suppressed, and that there's, by leaning into and accepting the greater and greater ridiculousness of the assertions made, it's almost a greater signaling of the power that one would be granting to it. And it makes it very difficult to try and, one, accurately explain to people how it's not just something that, while it is silly and you should be laughing at it, there's something more insidious related to it, because it picks up more momentum the more absurd it gets. And it feels as if there's no brakes on this at all and will just constantly accelerate. Do you share a similar view, or am I off base on any of that?
I share a similar view. Part of the right's mistake is that we view the forces on the left, as Oren said in his article, as initially they were dismissed as just mere college age students that were going through a routine fad or craze. However, as we see it's garnering more and more institutional power, and its ability to spread its ideology through our institutions has almost uniformly not been stopped at any perceivable metric or institution. Now, you could argue as of late that recent actions by the Supreme Court suggest there's not a total ideological capture of all institutions by wokeness. But as anybody who has worked in either a corporate environment or even a blue collar environment, any institution with an HR department is going to have some semblance of these forms or ideas, not only promoted by one or two individuals, but as the standard set of norms for the corporate culture. So, digging into why that is, as Aron says, wokeness is a powerful way to separate friend from enemy in a culture war. The ideas that the left seems to use appear to be quite abstracted. And I want to hone in specifically on that idea as I look at three different authors, if you'll permit me to read a couple choice quotes for us.
Yeah, feel free.
The first is from the most right wing and accepted philosopher slash writer, Yukimo Mishima, who authored Sun and Steel. A brief passage from his book on page 49. The sense of existence of a man with a massive physique must in itself be of the kind that embraces the whole world. For that man, considered as an object of knowledge, everything outside himself must be necessarily transferred onto the objective outside world and experienced by his senses. No accurate picture can be grasped under such circumstances unless one responds with a still more embracing awareness. The real question is staved off. The things one really wants to know are shelved. The only other alternative is for the imagination to take over unashamedly and adorn the other side with a whole variety of poems and fantasies. It's the end of the quote. Yukio then continues that all of his fantasy suddenly vanished when he began to lift and approach the real world with this philosophy. And it's this kind of ideology that he runs from, which I think encapsulates what the left is and a means by which the right can escape it. Or rather, if you have a certain disposition of perceiving the world a certain way, you're not going to be inclined to delude yourself through these various fantasies of ideology. I'll continue briefly with a quote from Jean Baudrillard: "The procession of simulacra. Simulation is no longer that of a territory, a referential being, or a substance. It is the generation by models of real without origin or reality, a hyper reality. The territory no longer precedes the map nor survives it. It is the real and not the map whose vestiges subsist here and there in the deserts which are no longer those of the empire, but our own, the desert of the real itself." And one final quote from Vilfredo Pareto. Before I read it, I just want to say the reason that I'm reading these quotes out of the books is that there is a contention on the right that we exist in the totally real world and that the left exists entirely in an abstraction, and that there's no cohesion between those ideas except in some kind of hyper-mimetic state of warfare. So just one last quote, and then we'll kind of ground it back into the discussion. The persistence of an abstraction, from section 1065 in Pareto's sociological writings. Once an agglomeration of relations has formed, there emerges a corresponding abstraction. This may persist, and if so, a new subjective entity is created. These residues are at the root of theology and metaphysics, which could be precisely defined as agglomerations of derivations from such residues. So those are the three quotes that I wanted to read, and I think that encapsulates what wokeness is and why it's so easy to spread. These residues, as Pareto calls them, the imaginations, as they're referred to in Mishima, and the desert of the real, as it exists in Baudrillard's simulations, refer to a kind of ideology that's impossible to pin down and is desperately believed in by a system of metaphysics which the right is entirely distinct from.
Yeah, it almost uses its own, has its own universe that it operates in. So to try and tangle with it, if you come from any sense of, for lack of a better term, like an objective relationship with reality, like the things that are, the things that exist that you can interact with, you don't question. You take them as written because they exist. For instance, you would never have to ask the question, what is a woman? You simply exist in the waters, and it is. And things get along, and it's how you can effectively find multiple religions that have a right-oriented sense to themselves, or produce, a localized culture that is oriented towards the right, because it's the natural harmony of nature and man staring upwards towards God and finding some sort of pathway to follow. But what happens with, this destabilizing force to us operates as a stabilizing force for something else. This encroachment of, what would it be, like an enforced delusional sense of yourself, or an enforced delusional sense of how reality is operating. It's a set of rules that basically are being placed upon you, and if you don't have the tools necessary to truly understand the power behind it, then it looks too absurd. You can actually be taken you've been taken advantage of by it by not taking it seriously enough. So my question comes into, like, one thing I worry about is obviously our world is being destabilized. The world of order and security and a sense of predictability to how social standards can operate. And we're slowly losing territory and slowly losing ground to this encroachment. Does this encroachment ever destabilize itself? And if it does so, when? Because there seems to be some sort of, if it's not an all-out tipping point where the ideology falls flat on itself and it resorts to some sort of arguably Stalin-esque figure having to step in and just restabilize it through force. Where do we see opportunities for small restabilizations of our own right? How do we get feet underneath us and do something accurate? It could be too big of a question for this conversation, but I hope my question makes sense.
Well, totally straightforward. So basically, in that sense, we have to contextualize the temporality of wokeness. And I think the perfect way to illustrate this as an example is to estimate what the lifespan of Clown World in the military is going to be. So addressing the permanence of the rights that wokeness is replacing is key to understanding it in terms of time frame. So the video that's discussed in Orrin McIntyre's Clown World article depicts a training video that was offered to the US Navy where two individuals are speaking at length about the necessity of pronouns and the importance of individuality and identity and gender recognition and all of the other catchphrases and buzzwords that we're so used to. The reason that this video exists as a training film for the Navy is because it has to be imposed by command on the lower enlisted and officers as a sort of understanding that this is the new power structure and this is the new moral framework and code of conduct. What's important about this video being shown not at a Goldman Sachs board meeting, but rather the United States military, is that the military already has an explicitly defined code of personal address, and if you can call it some kind of equivalence, pre-existing pronouns for its members. I'm thinking specifically within the military that officers and enlisted members are referred to by rank always and by last name. A first name is never used in a professional context in the United States military, and the title of sir and ma'am specifically is reserved for officers, whereas polite civilian society will allow sir and ma'am to be used as titles for all citizens. That distinction is very important. In a civilized society, sir and ma'am are a sign of respect, where respect is reserved specifically for officers who have earned it. What this does is it creates an integral part of the division between certain merits of individuals, and it also cements a permanent command structure. So what is kind of the history of this? Well, when we look at how personal conduct exists in the military today, it's not just the titles. A salute is rendered between enlisted and officers, as well as between officers themselves, but not between enlisted members of the military. This has to do with the organic genesis of a meritocracy within the military. Knights on the battlefield would salute one another by raising their visor to address each other verbally, and also by lifting the right arm, they took their armed hand away from their weapon. This is crucial. All of this is predicated on axioms of respect, and this same corruption is being taken advantage of by this Navy training video in these institutions. So where does lifespan and where does temporality come into play? What is the time frame of this instituted top-down mandated pronoun usage? Well, as we just discussed, pronouns within the military, the sir and ma'am of officers, the differentiation between enlisted and officers, as well as the concept of the salute, dates back hundreds, if not thousands of years in militaries throughout world history and throughout different civilizations. This suggests that it's entirely organic and that after the passing fad of wokeness goes its own way, that there will be some kind of continuance, or at the very least, the need for foundational respect in a military institution. I would posit the lifespan of this movement, this wokeness within the military, is directly limited to the amount of constant input and effort that must be put in by the command. That is, the moment that these training videos stop circulating, there is no organic means by which this ideology can propagate itself in an institution like the military. Sorry for being long-winded there.
No, you're right. I mean, looking at the screen here, none of this is organic. No soldier looks at this and says, yep, this was necessary to my training. I am now a better soldier because of it. The absolute tone of it is, it's insulting to a soldier. And I know that, whatever administrative force that brought it forward maybe they had some sort of malicious intent, but they have no understanding of how do we get to this point where they don't understand the necessity of someone to understand how respect is earned rather than demanded with flat, multi-colored, abstractions hanging behind you. And this is where I become so disheartened by stuff like this, not because it in of itself is anything other than, something that we can laugh at, but there's this massive disconnect from the hands that have the ability to wield this onto individuals that know that they need a necessary amount of encouragement and training to take on the realities of their position. I mean, otherwise they're openly stating that your position means nothing. You need to be indoctrinated more so than you need to learn how to do something physically real, how to protect your and your soldier's life that's beside you, and protect your nation. So the destabilization ends when there's a split from somewhere higher up, where the officers return to someone in the officer class, let's say, would return to a sense of organic order or organic authenticity. One sec. Let me remove this from the screen here. But when does that line get crossed? And how do we get to a point where that line is found and not too far along that, I don't know, arguably catastrophe sits on the other side? But there's something interesting about the desire to step into it as well. Like, you look at the two individuals we just had on there. They purposely did that. No one put a gun to their head and forced them to provide a pronoun lecture. They stepped into it, they put on their rainbow colored gear, and they happily clapped along like seals. What is this psychological state that people find themselves in where they lean into the clown world assimilation?
Well, in a raw sense, it's the insertion of a new power dynamic into the equation. The pronouns that are mentioned in the video are referred to as rights, and misgendering of pronouns is referred to as rights infringement, which is a direct destabilizer in an institution because it leverages the concept of liberal rights and protecting of the individual against a power dynamic which implies oppression. And make no mistake, the military is incredibly oppressive. It's set up by design to avoid these kind of power dynamics. That's why the rigidity and hierarchy which exists within it also allowed this corrupt ideology to so easily gain traction on the rails.
Yeah, when you mention oppression,
one
sorry, Phyllis,
senior.
but when you mention oppression, there, I just want to step in real quick here. There's an element. Basically, you're framing the upside of oppression, right? In the idea that the military is oppressive. That's not a negative statement you're saying. Maybe there's negative elements on the inside, but you're also talking about something positive that exists there as well.
That's correct. I mean, to put it entirely clearly, the military has two purposes: land, air, and sea, and that is to hold territory and to kill the enemy. And anything else besides those two aims is reductive and more reminiscent of civilian life and aims. And we, I think, got to this situation with the military specifically because in Clown World, you can't have clear, manageable, and conquerable objectives because that would require the kind of martial will which would force out this ideology which is being imposed. It would require the natural and healthy suppression of the individual against a greater good of the collective.
Yes. You'd have to assert at some point. You'd have to disagree with something and actually enter into conflict. Whereas, the spread of, Clown World Assimilation basically demands you just submit. It doesn't actually want to. It outsources all of its conflict to removing you from the conversation and pretending like you weren't even there, and then creating a myth about you that you were always bad to begin with. So the last thing it ever wants to do is actually have direct conflict, but it works its way into this total encompassing force that basically binds you from ever finding a way to enact a level of would be, I mean, I would argue that there's going to be a form of self-defense that you're going to naturally want to be fighting for, or at least intuitively reaching for, because once you come to the conclusion of exactly how suffocating all of this is, there's a natural reflex to try and find air, to try and find reality, that is.
I think that's incredibly important. And one element that facilitates their corruption is the right's desperate hope to try and breathe that air, to try and claw some separate space for itself, whether you want to call it parallelism, whether you want to call it a surface level victory. The most recent thought that I've been concerned with the past few months is throughout the kind of incompetence and continued economic decline, the heightened inflation, and many other issues that are plaguing both the country and the modern West, one of the biggest items that stood out to me is how disenchanted the woke and progressives are with their own ideology. This can't just exist as a force of power in and of itself without some kind of outside or alien enemy with which to fixate and direct its own energy towards. Ideology simply can't exist in a vacuum. The need to publish a training video for the Navy is encapsulated within the structure of the actual military itself. It's not published because that's the standard operating procedure as it exists already. It's because the opposite end of the ideology requires some kind of step in and power dominance. So I think another area is, I guess, to kind of segue a bit, looking at the Supreme Court victories this week. There's been 4 or 5 overt victories, from abortion to gun rights to limiting federal powers of the Environmental Protection Agency to impose on citizens and states. And it seems as though there's a continual flurry of right wing or right wing adjacent decisions that have come down from the Supreme Court, which seems weird because we consider many institutions within our government to have near total institutional capture by the woke, or at the very least, a very strong and overt presence.
Yeah,
I'm
it's
kind
a
of
2
getting,
step forward,
yeah.
1 step back feeling almost. We've gone 2 step forward into deep progressivism, and now we get 1 step back. And do we feel comfortable enough to call them victories, or is this just momentum for another 2 steps forward that's on the way?
I believe this is momentum for another 2 steps forward. And the big reason is that they're not trying to suppress a dogmatic figure such as Trump at this point. They're also not trying to crack down on these abstractions. They're realizing that they've been so successful in their implementation of their new ideology that they need to grant more power to the boogeyman in order to rally the troops against him.
Yeah, that's it's disheartening as well. Goodness. Yeah, it definitely feels like there's been a bit of a pressure release. So the right gets its chance to throw its arms up, have a little celebration, but in the meantime, your enemies are just gathering more power and using your reaction as a springboard into more insurgency on their own end.
Oh, that's correct. So we have a couple more points in the Discord chat. But were there any other areas that you wanted to talk about or direct the conversation before we got to that point?
No. I'm happy to move on. I feel we've dug ourselves into a dark enough hole. Let's see if we can go in a different direction.
Certainly. So I think the next area that we should cover is understanding the nature of male and female psychology within Clown World, and also how does this determine the velocity of assimilating people to this system, as well as how does it actually manifest in the world today.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems to be that gender dynamic split seems to be a prime vector that they always kind of lean on first, and then they divert it elsewhere. They maybe like change the conversation to race or sexuality at some point, but gender seems to be one of those primary vector points that starts the conversation even to begin with. I mean, this dates back early on. This arguably is the first assault on the family, if you're to use kind of traditional right terms to describe the American political pressure system. But um, the mental difference is split between men and women. Women seem to be more agreeable, which makes them more attainable for donning the clown world uniform. I would even wager that there's an element to one of the supreme powers of the opposite sex from ours, is that they have the capability to manipulate without physical coercion better. Like it's ingrained. It's a natural survival skill. It's a natural trait that they can leverage to their own advantage. And it seems to be one that in the clown world system, it gets taken full advantage over because it removes the idea that conflict is ever going to be part of the equation and arguably turns everyone into a psychological manipulator in some way. Like there's an element to the system of like you have to be a narcissist somehow if you're going to play this game. It's just what level of narcissism do you want to play?
I think that's a very good point. And when looking at these psychological types, whether it's narcissism or a rampant insecurity or whatever term that you'd like to pull out of either the DSM-5 or like a Jordan Peterson or a Carl Jung, the big concept to understand in the psychology of what's going on is the totalizing effect that a mental illness like this has. And I would venture as far as to say that the reason narcissism is all consuming is because it allows no room for the other. The reason that insecurity is so consuming is that it doesn't allow anything to breach in to the all consumed self. And when looking at the masculine and feminine, I think Jung would argue that there's something such as the anima, or as he called it, the all devouring mother, the Oedipus complex, whatever subconscious desires you'd like to frame it as. These totalitarian tendencies tend to come from the feminine traits of agreeableness and compassion. So, generally, in upper management, historically, disagreeableness or the masculine energy has been what derives the competition between certain high elected vice presidents or senior management. That is to say, that natural tension creates a meritocracy because you simply can't have the ability to prove an act of merit without some kind of obstacle or some kind of disagreement which needs to be overcome. So, disagreeableness's masculine tendencies were also counterbalanced in the 1970s and 80s with the rise of the personnel department, which later became human resources or HR. That concept from there is the feminine agreeableness that has initially started as an aim to counterbalance the overly masculine energies in corporations, but eventually to equal it and then to heavily supplant it. So the feminine need to be agreeable in a corporate environment is now the mantra of upper management in a company, as well as in the military. So, as Eric von Kuhnelt-Leddihn said in his book Leftism, there are certain totalitarian and monolithic tendencies inherent in democracy that are not even present in the absolute monarchy. The essential interest of these companies, these corporations, and these military units is to institute a kind of all-consuming agreeableness, which is essentially totalitarian in its aims. If you have a single person that does not abide by the new policies, the new agreeableness, or the new mandated empathy or compassion, what you have is disagreeableness, which is by virtue of its exclusion, just a toxic tendency.
Yeah, it's a you will be agreeable at all costs. Otherwise, you don't get to be inside. It's the I don't know. There's like the heavy emphasis on excluding something from the flat egalitarian circle tends to be like I would say a symbol being passed around through time as this ideology has continued to manifest itself. the and it shows how back to the connection between narcissism and insecurity by flattening the vertical, by flattening the, for lack of a better term, like an organic hierarchy, an organic, someone with whatever God-given talents was able to compete, do better, and build something upwards. Well, if you're insecure and heavily narcissistic, a very dangerous combination, and then given the ability to basically flatten all competitors that would otherwise cast a shadow upon you, you basically find a way to completely nullify a sense of authentic competition, or that sense of like, arguably what I'm trying to say is you become a prime manager. You can sit there and manage variables as you need them rather than letting unpredictable variables, which would be your hyper disagreeable, very competitive types, to, you know, fly at their own pace or do something risky and you know, take a gamble on something that might pay off big. But this,
Yeah,
yeah, go for
certainly.
it.
And there's an interesting show on the History Channel. I mean, as I want to illustrate this. Take it. I mean, won't take it too far afield. In the early 20th century, all these different food manufacturers and companies began exploding in revenue and began to dominate the food service industry as it exists today. And why were they able to do this? They were able to take massive risks. The big invention that made Frito Lay chips popular and sellable in such scales and quantities and qualities was the invention of the type of bag that it was sold in, not of any particular virtue of the potato chip itself. The big selling point for Heinz ketchup and canneries was not the innovation of making a better ketchup, which requires agreeableness to find the lowest common denominator of a quality ketchup, if you will. It requires the disagreeableness of going to all your competitors and saying, I'm going to make a better can than all of you. And once I make that better, safer, and more hygienic can, I'm going to lobby the federal government to impose food safety restrictions and to found the modern Food and Drug Administration. That is actually the origin story of the FDA, was as a disagreeable competitor in the food service industry. And if you trace the invention of nearly every famous American product, you will at some point encounter a disagreeable man, a visionary, someone who's able to marshal energy, to look at his competitors, to play dirty, and most importantly, to succeed at all possible costs. There is, however, a stage in which agreeableness is necessary in an institution. At some point, there's a balance of the two. Too much agreeableness leads to stifled opinion and premature consensus, yet too much disagreeableness leads to business failure and ruination on a long enough time frame. A healthy organization will have both of these facets balanced. So, if you'll allow me a few moments more of talking, the biggest problem in a modern corporation such as Uber or Lyft or Amazon or whatever industry is that the ability to play it safe is far more important than the ability to create a new service. The biggest growth in the services sector in the United States is taking a previously healthy business. So let's take the taxi cab industry. It was supplanted by Uber, privatized, its workers were turned into consultants, and then the business was able to decimate the industry, privatize, and just totally eliminate the ability of taxi drivers to make money. It's the gigification of the taxi industry. DoorDash, same thing. Pizza delivery boy is now replaced by an elderly man who's scraping together a few bucks for even less money. And the biggest growth of all these different service sectors, even Amazon replacing the USPS with cheaper shipping and distribution, is that you have a privatization, a bottoming out of the ability of individual entrepreneurs or very successful cab drivers, pizza delivery boys, or shipping companies to make more money on an individual scale. You're just going to have primarily as the business end the agreeableness of simply having as many products and privatized services as humanly possible, even if there isn't a necessary need for them, and even if it makes the overall industry worse. Forgive me, that's a bit of a digression from the topic, but these
No, I mean,
institutions,
it is and it isn't. Because in a
yeah,
sense, these are also all of the same. These are like the first corporations to lean into putting on the Clown World uniform.
exactly.
Whether that's, because they're all San Francisco based or based out of some sort of coastal city, but, they've obviously, what is it? They've played by a set of rules that now that they own the market, they can then just shut everybody else out and then become the only game in town.
Right. They use agreeableness to cement their own positions within that industry and also to stifle any possibilities of internal dissent. There's never going to be a unionization push at Uber.
Or if it
The
is,
entire
it'll
premise
be
of it,
managed and kindly swept under the rug very easily.
exactly. And the toxic element of agreeableness is that it can be used as a consolidation method of power. Nobody wants to be the odd man out in the room. And you can also look indeed at these other scales. There's an experiment done in the 1950s, Stanley something or other. The man took 50 people into a room, and he said, on the other side of this room, there's a man in an electric chair.
Mm.
And you're just going to, oh, sorry, this is called the Milgram
Yeah, it's the
experiments.
Milgram test. Yeah.
So for our audience, this man, Stanley Milgram, he was dressed in a white lab coat, and he had a couple assistants in the room with clipboards taking ambiguous notes. And he directed these totally random strangers, test subjects off the street, brought them into a room and said, push this button. And they pushed a button, and they heard on the intercom a man supposedly in an electric chair being tortured. And there was a dial next to the button to increase the supposed voltage. And there was no corralling, there was no harassment from the authority figures. There was simply, after the button was pushed and the yell of the supposed individual being tortured, the people in the lab coats would simply say to the civilian test subject, increase the dosage, up the voltage, just increase it. And what they found is that 95% of people simply went along with the torturing as long as it was directed by people that were seeking agreeableness, and the total kind of suppression. I mean, very, very few people actually stopped the experiment or even refused to participate or even get aggressive with the scientists in the lab coats. The human desire to be agreeable can outweigh any moral sentiment that an individual can naturally have. This is the greatest danger, and I think it also takes us on to our longer fourth point.
Yeah. One point on the Milgram test before we jump that I want to comment on is that there's also an element of, they're being told to turn this dial, or they're being told that by someone in a white lab coat. They're being told that by an expert, someone that's supposed to be effectively in a position of, earned expertise. And so part of the, I don't know, the walk away that you can have from the Milgram is also an acknowledgement that when people see authority, they follow it, and they'll follow it to the letter, especially if it's an authority that they themselves hold to be true. They actually won't question the authority or what's going on at some point, which is a very interesting aspect of human nature. And I think this, goes tightly to conversations you and I have had about elite theory in general, where, the people just need to be told what to do. Effectively, the character of who is offering out the orders into what direction makes a massive play into the results that follow. So if we're diagnosing and looking at what's going on with people putting on the Clown World uniform, it's partly because they see that is the power and that is the authority that they would choose rather than a separate authority. Now, is it because the authorities that exist elsewhere have been flattened or removed from position, or is it purely simply that they've lost the taste bud to see something else as an authority? I'll pass that question on to you, and I'll get ready for the next question here.
I think just kind of. I'm sorry. Could you just kind of repeat that again, just for my own?
So effectively, what I'm trying to describe is that there's a vacuum. There's a lack of trust or acknowledgement of an honest authority. Maybe how about this? If we use, the church as an example, someone who is religious, axiomatically, they're taking a higher authority than the material world as the authority. So they, naturally should be following what would be the laws of God. What we're seeing with Clown World is arguably not only just the implementation of a new religion, but a new set of authority figures that fill that rank as well. And these people
agree.
are more likely to fall into this if they lack or have maybe grown up without kind of that spiritual center that allows them to see a higher authority over the material world.
Oh, I agree. I mean, being able to separate yourself from the power structure is important. I think what gives the woke ideology such strength is that none of its priestly class is an ordained priest. There is no physical church. There is no finishing school for the elite members of its cadre. The entirety of individuals who step up in DEI, they might have a gender studies degree, but they are equally as likely to have any other type of degree. The two individuals in the actual training video, they're engineers at the Naval Undersea Warfare Center. There's no professional credentialing for them in their role and what they're speaking on with the gender ideology. They're simply two individuals who, by virtue of making this video, are able to gain power within their own institution. But that also makes it very hard to oppose. It's difficult to dispute information when there is no institution that it's attached to. This is where the importance of individual resistance comes in, and to address your point of how can a person actually resist or unplug from it. The reality is you are going to have to sit through the video. You are going to have to use the pronouns if you're in a meeting with people that are managers or above you, or at least find some clever way to skirt it. And this power dynamic, crucially, doesn't enable you to take a religious vow of silence against it, or the ability to even just be neutral or ambivalent. You don't even have the right within the woke ideology to just simply be ignorant of its ethos or its mantra or its manifestations. If you have no experience to it, you're called upon to educate yourself, which is an incredibly insidious ideology because that puts the burden on you. If this was a true institution, if this was truly something that legitimately wanted to flex its own power, it would have avatars and licensed, credentialed people to spread it. And notice that while the woke ideology has experts and credentials on nearly every single other form of its power base, from law to medicine to science and to politics, there is no credentialing for the gender nonconformity or the woke progressive ideology that forms a lot of a base of its side institutions. It's ephemeral in its institutional standing.
Yeah, and it seems very much like that lack of credentialing, that lack of proof, short of just adorning the attire, is actually, arguably part of it. It's another element of the dress up. So if you send a message instead of, I received one earlier from work, and effectively it was a women's self-defense class, but they spend 4 sentences trying to say everything but for women only. And even then, you could still be a man and go, because they still include, you could be a trans woman, you can be, bisexual and identify this way. Effectively, just because effectively it was a level of signaling on board by saying everything but men are also included, that the message itself doesn't matter. The actual content that you're trying to portray means nothing. What matters is that you posted a external script to showcase how willing and how far you want to take it to show that you're on side. And I would argue that it's fairly subconscious, or even this. Maybe they actually did want to share something about women's self-defense classes, but because the ideology sits higher than anything else, they had to spend an extra 20 minutes writing down every possible orientation besides men to allow themselves to express themselves. It baffles me in that sense that people would let themselves get caught up in something so deeply entangling and contradictory. But I would also wager from, as McIntyre said, that's actually part of the point. The fact that you're willing to do that to yourself is a badge that you can pin on your shirt to show how deep into the ideological stream you are.
Exactly. And it seems to be bending over backwards to be as inclusive and to be as non confrontational and to be as warm and loving as it can be. Um, this might not necessarily be a conscious desire by anybody who's within the system or trying to promote it. Um, from the fourth element, there's a kind of continual forced positivity is this endemic focus of this corrupted regime. You always have to be positive. You always have to be receptive. You always must be inclusive, and all possible variables must be consideration when you're trying to be tolerant. So, but Why does this happen? It seems so artificial, but it's so omnipresent in these institutions. The philosopher Byung-Chul Han maintains the concept of a palliative regime as, and I quote from him directly, our societies today are characterized by a universal algophobia, a generalized fear of pain. We strive to avoid all painful conditions. Even the pain of love is treated as suspect. This algophobia extends into society. Less and less space is given to conflicts and controversies that might prompt painful discussions. End quote. What this essentially means is that by mentioning assigned women at birth, by mentioning trans women, by mentioning everything except the single word woman. You do everything in your possible to avoid your own perception of inflicting pain on others and also having pain inflicted upon you.
Yeah, the primary currency that they constantly barter between themselves is whether or not it's more tolerable, more accessible, um, you know, more friendly and affirming. Nothing about it, unless you're a specific, straight white man, which is where you can scapegoat all of your energy towards. Everything else has to have some sort of amendment towards a level of care and a level of treatment. And pain and conflict seem to be the ultimate antithesis. Um, I mean, arguably, if you want to talk about how does one find some way to get someone else to unplug, simply doing things that are physical and challenging is a way of engaging with like the physical sense of disagreeing. It's disagreeing with that voice in your head that tells you to, not push as hard. I mean, arguably, all competition is a form of disagreeableness, and if you find a way to get someone to compete, there's a chance that arguably you can introduce them to a dose of reality that might be able to slightly pull the veil back. And if you're in a company or if you're in a position where you have any sort of, leverage or sway, establishing competition as a necessary virtue might be one way to build a barrier that can't be eroded, or at least you'll be the last person holding it up until they kindly ask you to leave. But even then, establishing something that forces people to put skin into the game of some degree is it's going to subvert their efforts for subversion, for lack of a better term.
Exactly. And there is, I think, as individuals, a singular way out of this, which is to acknowledge that pain avoidance is ultimately going to lead in pain itself, even if it's going to be delayed. Um, Pain in life must be confronted head on and it must be dealt with. the most psychologically harmful form of pain is ignoring it. Pain exists because it requires immediate attention. And when trying to consistently and constantly avoid conflict, you're not rubbing the conflict out of existence. You're not minimizing the tension that's inherent in all interpersonal affairs and corporations. What you're doing is you're simply deferring it into other mechanisms, to passive aggressive conduct, to these minute power divisions between people. And you're also lending yourself essentially a constant institution wide level of persistent animosity. There's a tension there to all of this loving and compassion within this message. There's a tension of, if you don't acknowledge it, then you are our enemy, which is a bold statement, but that's the operating parameters of the institution itself. So
Yeah.
I think one other point is that I kind of lost my train of thought there. So continue.
Yeah, I would say the continual outsourcing of something else to do the pain tolerance for you tends to be a primary calling card of the end result of this ideological sweep. It doesn't take too long of looking at Twitter bios to try and just count the number of mental illnesses they're happily claiming to have. And you could look at the amount of SSRIs the current American population is on to see that, the running from some sort of engagement with something painful, maybe not even be a product, but could be a root cause of exactly why it spreads so far and wide, and why people would, that in conjunction with, I would say, a loss of a vision of God, but a sense of trying to run from pain in general would cause someone to put on the wardrobe. They'll cause someone to put on the clown wig and the clown nose, because they have already made an agreement with themselves that they don't want to face pain. They don't want to face discomfort. Arguably, they don't want to face reality. And so this new power structure emerges that rewards you the more that you run away from it.
Exactly. And I think as any religious or even right wing person would just tell you, frankly, pain, suffering, sin, these are all intrinsic, daily lived realities of the human condition. You are not going to run from it, you're not going to hide from it. And this delusional attempt to try and master and diffuse pain out of existence is, at some times, in some places, it's a noble aspiration as a means to cultivate a quiet inner strength. This is why, on the other side of the coin, many of these individuals, the bravery, the sincerity, the authenticity of a lived experience, these are all buzzwords and keywords that are crucial to this ideology. It's a sort of inversion of the Christian sense of virtue, where essentially there's this tacit acknowledgement that individuals that are gender dysphoric or whatever else, these individuals that need the pronouns the most, are actually somehow the strongest among us for bearing oppression, and the strongest among us for being discriminated against, and that they are somehow better and more morally virtuous people than somebody who does not have that history or share those sentiments. It's a core assumption, and that's why the palliative element really is a deep incoherency in this ideology. Why would somebody who has inner strength and is validated and is a strong, independent person, why do they need to be so affirmed? Why do they need to be treated with such gloves? But
Right.
you could say that about almost every single issue or influential person on the left today.
Yeah, and I'll tie this back to where we started. I mean, to simply be requires no affirmation. You just are, and that's the essence of, they scream to be affirmed, when if you truly are stable in your footing, you need not say anything. You simply act and go and follow what would be a higher calling, a true purpose, whatever. You simply exist to do what needs to be done, rather than, put on a uniform to signal to something else, to signal to the flat circle around you.
Exactly. And the final one last example I'll give to kind of wrap this on is the U.S. Marine Corps recently approved, instead of so on the right side of your uniform, you have the eagle, globe, and anchor as the symbol of the United States Marine Corps. On the left side, you typically have your rank or your unit. And on your battle dungarees, the Marine Corps has authorized the pride pin instead of all other things. So you have the largest possible denomination of the military, coupled with the pride pin replacing the smallest possible tight knit community within it, overtly, physically taking its place on your uniform and signifying your membership in that ideology rather than in your smallest trusted and most beloved community. And that is the perfect encapsulation of what this ideology is and how it is manifesting today.
Oh, that's absolutely terrible. And a very good spot for us to end. Philos, thank you for your time. Thank you for everything you brought. Have a good day. And thank you to all who took the time to come and listen.
Thank
Goodbye.
you as well, Heroic Will.